the format of today's session is that we are going to talk about prof for about half an hour, and then we are going to have a discussion about prof and kind of have various back and forths for the rest half an hour. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. So because I only have half an hour to introduce prof, I'll go over the slides quickly. Hopefully, you are already well familiar with some of the basic MEV things. So we'll go over them quickly, and then, of course, we can revisit some of the things during the second half of the session. So let me share my screen, and we can start.
Feel free to raise questions in the interval. And since it's weekend, I think we won't be that strict on the time frame. So as long as Kushal, you have time, so we are all good right now. Yeah.
Sounds good. I do have a lot of time, so no.
Cool. Yeah.
All right. So the title for the session is Prof Protected Order Flow in a Profit-Seeking World. And this is work that is jointly done with several people at UIUC, including Andrew Miller's group and Ari Juels' group at Cornell Tech and Fidelity Center for Advanced Technologies. Okay. So I'm sure you're familiar with the MEV problem, which is validators have complete control over the blocks that they build, and as a result, they can reorder users' transactions, censor transactions, and even insert their new transactions. And this was uncovered in the original Flash Boys paper in 2019. Now, since 2019, how has the community dealt with MEV? So there are basically two radically different approaches that the community has taken, symbolized by these two different paths here. The first one is what I call systematization of value extraction. And in this approach, there's a core assumption that extraction is inevitable. And because validators are rational agents, they would just extract as much as they can. But this approach takes that as a given and then tries to, in some sense, democratize this value extraction so that even the validators who don't have the ability to extract can extract as much as the sophisticated validators. As a result, systematically value extraction is happening by all validators, and this is commonly referred to as proposer-builder separation, this marketplace between builders who are building these profitable blocks for proposers who are looking to extract value from users. Now, while this value is being extracted by validators, often the profits do come at the expense of ordinary users, and this leaves them vulnerable to systematic value extraction. Now, the way I like to think about it is basically in this, power balance, validators have all the power, and ordinary users have no power in the original vision of the PBS. This model of rational validators is in some sense actually validated by the past 1 or 2 years of data, which is most of the blocks on Ethereum are now being built using PBS. So while it is widespread in industry, that provides an evidence of this rational model of validators that they will extract and they will kind of jump on every opportunity that they can. The second approach to dealing with this problem is this line of fair ordering work. There are two broad categories in it. First one is the temporal fair ordering. In this approach, basically there's a decentralized protocol which gives you some assurance over front-running capabilities of adversary. This approach says if sufficiently many nodes receive transaction 1 before transaction 2, then the output of the protocol will be transaction 1 before transaction 2. So what that means is an adversary cannot front-run unilaterally. It has to front-run at a lot of places in order to get that priority, which makes it quite difficult. The second category of this approach is blind ordering, which says that you should order transactions without looking at the contents of the transaction. Now, these two approaches are complementary, I should point out. They are not exclusive. So you could have both blind ordering and temporal fair ordering. Now, while these approaches do protect users, and there's a large body of academic literature, really these approaches have this core assumption about honest majority. So the question is, why would a rational validator opt into fair ordering unless the protocol is enforcing it at the basic level. So the way I like to think about this approach is, users would be happy. They are getting some sort of fairness guarantees. We'll talk about different notions of fairness, but they are getting some sort of fairness guarantee. But validators have no incentive to opt into this system. There's some other externality as well about latency racing, which I'll talk about in the context of prof as well. Okay. So the practical question that we ask in this work, so our motivation is basically, can users get protection against the most pernicious forms of MEV? I want to be clear that not all MEV is bad. Some MEV is needed for the functioning of the markets, but against the most pernicious forms of MEV like front-running, sandwiching, forced liquidations, and so on, can they get protection while accounting for validators who are rational and in some sense restore the power balance between the users and the validators? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about prof, which in some sense merges these two approaches that have been taken by the community. And I think it's a very, very good sweet spot between the two approaches. So the main characteristics of the mechanism are, you'll see it's ridiculously simple. It's backward compatible. At least it's simple on the high level. There are a lot of details that we'll talk about. And that's where it gets very interesting. It's backward compatible with the current PBS mechanism, the current way blocks are being built on Ethereum. It protects users, of course, but crucially, it also maintains some level of service quality. So I'll talk about what kind of service degradation can happen, but it tries to protect against any form of service degradation as well for users, mostly in terms of inclusion of their transactions. And the final one is it accounts for, of course, rational validators. Okay, so here's one slide summary of prof design. The idea is prof ingests protected order flow. So order flow that needs protection goes into prof. Even mempool transactions can go into prof, but once you send your transaction to mempool, there's essentially no guarantee anybody can provide. But ideally, transactions are sent to prof in a protected way. And prof assembles these transactions in a bundle, which I'm calling a fairly ordered transaction bundle. We'll talk about different notions of fairness, but it essentially orders them according to some notion of fairness, and also keeps these transactions encrypted, so it doesn't reveal these transactions to anybody. Then it takes a block and simply appends the prof bundle to this block and produces an enriched block. Now, the crucial thing to note here is that if the original block had reward R, we are not changing anything about the blue block's execution. We are only appending things to it. So the new enriched block will have a reward R plus epsilon for the validator, epsilon coming from the transaction fees inside prof. Okay. So from a validator's perspective, which block would the validator choose? Would it choose the original block B with reward R, or an enriched block which gives it a slightly higher reward? Well, if the validator is rational, it would, of course, choose the enriched block with the prof bundle. And from a user's perspective, user has the choice of either sending their transactions to mempool and get MEV extracted from them, or send transactions to prof and pay that epsilon fee for a penny, for example, and get included in the final block. We'll also talk about some other recent mechanisms that have come into PBS, like MEV share and so on, MEV blocker, which allow you to also have some sort of front-end protection. Okay, so it's clear that even from a user's perspective, it's incentive compatible for users to send their transactions to prof. Now, let me talk about how prof, the details of the mechanism and how it fits into the existing system of building blocks, namely PBS. At a high level, the thing to focus here is there's this relay, which is a trusted auctioneer, and it basically facilitates an auction between the block builders, and it sends the most profitable block to the validator. Okay. The key insight in prof is you take this existing PBS system, there's a standard relay which is getting all the blocks, supplying the most profitable block, denoted by the blue block here, to the validator. It enhances that relay to also take in these protected order flow and supplies the validator with a higher profitable block. So the idea is the protected order flow gets ingested into a prof sequencer. We'll talk about the sequencer as well as we go on. But it takes these transactions, sequences them in a fair way, and then sends it to a relay, which appends these transactions to the most profitable block from the auction. So it carries on its auction as it would in the normal PBS. And then at the end, when it has the most profitable block, it will append the prof transactions to it and send to the validator. Now, the key insight here is that the validator is given a take it or leave it choice. What I mean by that is that the validator, if it takes the prof block, that's good. But if it doesn't take the prof block, then it learns nothing about the prof transactions. That's the key point. So if the validator rejects it, it will not learn anything about prof transactions, which means that users have this protection guarantee in case their block is not chosen. Okay, now I'll talk about how we enforce the take it or leave it guarantee in prof. But before that, let's look at why should relays support prof, like this kind of like bundle merging for prof. Well, relays are also competing for market share, right? And the appending of prof bundle to the block from coming from the auction only makes the relay more likely to be chosen by the validator. There are several relays and they are all competing for market share as well. And so all else equal, a prof enhanced relay should be more competitive than a relay which does not adopt prof. And as you might have already seen, the workflow for builders, at least in the basic design, I'll talk about some hybrid designs as well for optimistic relays, but at least in the basic design, the workflow for builders remains completely unchanged. So they don't need to be bothered about transactions coming into prof. Okay. Now, we also utilize T's as a difference in depth because why should you trust, prof sequencer and other entities that are kind of doing this appending of prof transactions? So even though relays are trusted, so right now builders are trusting the relays for their privacy of their blocks, and validators are trusting the relays for the validity of the underlying block. In prof, we don't want to make that assumption, at least in the TE version. If you are fine with that assumption, that's okay. But if you're not, then TEs can be used as a defense in depth. And what I mean by that is if relays are honest but curious, they're kind of just, appending the prof transactions, but also, leaking about something about them. If you want protection against them, then you can run the bundle merger at the relay inside a TE. I'll talk about the prof sequencer and some TE use cases there as well towards the later part of the presentation. Okay, I'm sure many of you are aware of the TE model, but very quickly, TEs give you these two properties, integrity and confidentiality. And with respect to prof, it means that the prof bundle will be appended in a manner which is tamper-proof, and nobody will learn outside the TE what the contents of prof transactions are. It's essentially a trusted third party which can prove to an external user that it's indeed running things in a tamper-proof and private way. Okay, so that's the high-level model for TEs, and there are various TEs out there: Intel, SGX, TDX, AWS Nitro. These are some of the most prominent examples. And so the simple mental model is it's basically a trusted third party that would do the job in an integrity and confidentiality preserving way. Okay. And some people might have some reservations against TEs, but I would like to point out that TEs are already used for block building. Flashbots is pioneering this work, but they're already being used in block building, and most notably in this new project, SWAV, which critically relies on TEs. So TEs are already being embraced by the community, and we leverage them in case of honest but curious relays. Okay, so now diving into the details of the workflow for prof, first look at the workflow for PBS. Builders are supplying their blocks to relays, and relays essentially take custody of these blocks and then send a header to the validator, which signs the header back, which is a cryptoeconomic commitment from the validator that it will indeed propose that block and nothing else. And only then the relay releases the transactions or the underlying block to the validator. Okay, so how do we now integrate prof into this workflow? Well, it's quite simple. This is the summary of the design. You run the auction as it is, which is the max MEV block selector at the relay, and then you input the best profitable block into this prof bundle merger, which would take an encrypted prof bundle coming from the prof sequencer, append that bundle, and then only spit out a header to the validator. And then once the validator signs that header, only then the best enriched block is revealed to the validator. And in this figure, you can already see that while you are doing the enrichment, if a new block comes at the relay, then we send the best of the two blocks. So if the yellow block or the peach block that you see here arrives while you are doing the enrichment, then we again, before sending the header, see which one is the better. So for the validator, even the enrichment process is kind of not affecting the profitability of the block. It still gets the most profitable block from the relay. Okay. So the timeline for prof looks something like this. There are two paths that the relay follows concurrently. The orange path, which is the vanilla PBS path, and concurrently it also follows a prof path in which you similarly do the auction, but there's a delta latency at the end where you take the time to append the prof bundle to the auction. As a result, you do have a shorter auction, and what that means is the auction, the block to which you are appending the prof bundle in the blue path, that might be slightly less profitable than the orange path. So that's what we call the latency penalty coming from the delta latency of appending the prof transactions. And on the other hand, while you have the latency penalty from shorter auction, on the other hand, you have fee that's coming from the prof transactions. So you can already see that there's this break-even equation that's going on between the auction profits and the profits from the fee inside the prof transactions. So the inclusion or the kind of the inclusion of prof transactions, which means that the blue path is more profitable than the orange path, that critically depends on whether the fee from prof transactions are able to compensate for the latency penalty of appending the prof transactions. And to kind of better have an idea of that, let me show you what the latency penalty looks like. So this is the data from Flashbots. Other relays have similar patterns. But the idea is, if you look at the red line, which is 90 percentile of the slots, then as you have more and more latency, you have more and more latency penalty because the auction is getting shorter. And the black line basically shows if you have about 85 milliseconds of latency, then that in 90% of the slots leads to about 0.003 ETH worth of penalty from the auction. Okay. So the inclusion likelihood for prof can be modeled something like this. So the inclusion likelihood depends on whether the probability that the fees from prof transactions is able to compensate for the latency penalty. And the fees from prof transactions is essentially the gas used in prof transactions multiplied by the fee. The fee here is gamma F. Gamma is just the overhead on top of the base fee F. So the total fee is gamma F, and the gas used is G. So the total fee from prof transactions is G times gamma F. So you can already see that there is a relationship here. By the way, the latency delta also depends on the gas used. So if you have a bigger prof bundle, then in some sense you'll take more time to simulate it. So delta also depends on gas used. So there's a three-dimensional relationship here between alpha, the inclusion likelihood, the gas used in the prof bundle G, and the gamma, which is the overhead that prof transactions need to pay on top of the minimum base fee that Ethereum charges. So this is the three-dimensional relationship that looks like for our prototype. Our prototype is not completely optimized, but you can already see that even for something like a prof bundle which has about 750K gas, which is about 5 Uniswap transactions, if the transactions are willing to pay 10% of the base fee, then you get more than 95% inclusion rate. So that fee is enough for you to compensate for any latency in the auction. So in most of the cases, you can have very high inclusion likelihood. And as you can see, as more and more transactions go through prof, the overhead for the same inclusion rate goes down. So for the same inclusion rate, you have to pay less and less fee because essentially you have larger and larger flow going through prof. So in some sense, they have more collecting bargaining power in some sense. Okay. How much time do I have? Let me see.
Oh, no rush. But you can stop by to check whether our audience have some questions. Yeah.
If there are any
Please.
questions, I can entertain any clarifying questions now, and then we can have more detailed discussions toward the end.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could explain this graph again. I'm not sure if I followed. I understood the probability expression from the previous slide, but
Right.
this is a bit kind of overwhelming right now.
Right. So if you look here, the fees are basically the size of the prof bundle, G, multiplied by the fee price, the price that each transaction pays per unit gas. And the price is basically gamma F, where F is the base fee and gamma is the overhead, right? So if the base fee is 10 GUE and your overhead is 10%, then each transaction is essentially paying 1 GUI uh, in tips to the validator. So the total fee that the validator would collect is G times 1 GUI. So that's G gamma F. And that should be greater than the latency penalty in the auction, which is coming from the latency delta. The latency delta itself depends on the gas used in the prof bundle most of the times, right? Like if the prof bundle is larger in terms of the gas used, then it takes more time to append that bundle to the auction block. So the delta latency itself depends on G. So if you look at this equation, there is a three-dimensional relationship between the inclusion likelihood, the size of the prof bundle, gas use G, and the uh, price or the overhead that each prof transaction needs to pay on top of the base fee. So this three-dimensional relationship is what I'm plotting here between alpha, G, and gamma, uh, based on the latencies that we observe for simulating prof transactions in our prototype. So the idea is, as prof transactions get larger and larger, you kind of amortize their latency costs, but the fee from those transactions get bigger and bigger. So you get higher and higher inclusion likelihood for the same.
So you're saying that the larger the prof bundle, or in terms of, I guess, the MEV of the prof bundle, the
The gas used of the
better
prof.
better it's able to offset the PBS part bundle. Essentially.
That's exactly right. So the idea is, as the prof bundle size goes up, in some sense, if you had, say, 100K gas being used in prof bundle versus 1 million gas used in prof bundle, the price that each transaction needs to pay per unit gas, you can imagine, will go down as there is 1 million gas. So the fee from those 1 million gas will be quite high. So the idea is, as more and more transactions go through prof, which means the size of the prof bundle goes larger and larger, you get better and better inclusion likelihood for the same amount of fee.
That makes sense. So, like, I know that the more private order flow you get, the better the chances of you winning the PBS auction. So I'm wondering why the prof bundle would see better MEV than the PBS bundle, because that is already encompassing private order flow, right?
These transactions are sent only to prof. So the idea is, these transactions are protected. They're only sent through prof. The PBS auction is happening like it is happening. There's no difference. These transactions are only made available to prof. And so the idea is, in some sense, prof is providing much larger value to the validator. So you can afford to spend the time to simulate it and add it to the block.
How can we assume that these only go to prof? Aren't there other protection schemes that would also apply to the PBS bundle?
So maybe let me kind of take a step back. The idea here is, the PBS auction is happening like it is happening, right? Like prof, in some sense, is not bothered by how the PBS blocks are being constructed. They might be constructed through, SGX builder, any other builder, by the by any other kind of searchers. But the idea is, you take that block and you append the prof transactions to it. The prof transactions should ideally be sent only to prof sequencer. If they're sent to some other builder as well, that's okay. But in that case, if that builder includes that transaction, then you can't include the same transaction twice. So that's as good as that transaction being not sent to prof. So if you send the transaction to both places and that transaction already appears in the PBS block, then in prof bundle, we'll pluck out that transaction while appending that bundle to the builder's block.
Okay, so you're assuming that all the other transactions are not protected, just using, say, passport protect.
That's not true. So that's not the case. This graph is just analyzing how much fee you have to pay to compensate for the shorter auction that is happening. The auction is shortening because you are taking the time to simulate the prof bundle at the end of the auction. So you do the PBS auction, and then you could, if there was no appending or any more work to be done, then you could just fire off that block to the validator. But because now we are appending the prof bundle to it, the auction has to end a little bit earlier. And so that's the penalty that you get, because if you're running the auction for a little bit shorter amount of time, then the most profitable block from the auction will be a little bit smaller. So going back to this this kind of scheme that you have, this graph is comparing in how many of the times will the enriched block, which is blue plus green, will be higher than the peach block, the late block, yellow block. So while you are appending the prof bundle, how much does the bid improve in the MEV auction?
That makes sense. Yeah, thanks so much for that.
Right. So this graph is just saying if your prof enrich block, which is the bottom block, is better than the peach block, then you have inclusion of prof transactions. If it's not, then you are not included, because the relay is choosing the best of the two. So in how many times the enriched block is winning over the peach block. So that's what we are plotting here.
Yeah, so I have a question regarding this. For example,
Yeah.
in a relay, if multiple builders are sending their blocks, so first you select a block and then you enrich that block?
Yeah.
Or like, how do you do?
That's right. So the best block out of all the builders is chosen, and then we enrich that.
I see. And so multiple relayers can do the same thing and propose something to the validator, and then they have to choose based on the bid, right?
Yeah. So just like right now, multiple relays are competing as well. So similarly, multiple relays can enrich through prof. So prof sequencer will send them prof bundles to all the relays, whoever is interested. And then those relays can also perform enrichment. And then it depends on the validator's MEVBoost client to choose the best of the relays.
I see. And basically this enshrined part somehow has to make up for the lost cost of MEV that could have attained in that time.
That's right. So I don't want to say MEV. I just want to say the lost revenue from the auction, the short-end auction, because it's not like MEV is being lost. Typically, when you see these kind of, if you look at these like simulations or like these visualizations which show how the bids are improving, the best bid from the auction, how that is improving as the slot goes on, as more and more time passes, the bids kind of improve. At the very end, they don't improve because there's more MEV or you're missing out on MEV. They improve because builders are trying to up their bid for the same block. So the idea is, okay, if you miss out on those kind of improvements on the bids, then how much do you have to compensate in the fee?
And this basically this latency that you were talking about in that equation earlier, it's mostly about because the number of gas it's going to have, the more time it's going to take, right?
Yeah,
And
roughly.
then,
Yeah, that's the proxy that we're using for latency. You can see the paper for more details on how latency varies with gas used. It's sort of linear with the gas used. Ethereum does a very
and
good job of
and to the yes, right. And to the end user, how do you like recommend a better price for protected order flow? Like how do that end user needs to compare? Should I send it to builder directly or the protected overflow sort of relay?
That's a good question. I would suggest that if you want 100% inclusion, send it to the builder and send it to the mempool and send it to prof. Send it everywhere. If you're only looking for, say, 95% plus inclusion likelihood, then send it to prof if you are willing to pay 10% of the base fee. So if you're willing to pay, if the base fee right now is, say, 20 GUI and you're willing to pay 2 GUI in tips, then send it to prof. The other recommendation is if you are looking not for the top of the block, because prof transactions would go at the bottom. So if you are like a centralized exchange to DEX arbitrager and you want the top of the block priority, then you go through, the builder's block and everything, because prof transactions would not go at the top. But if you're an ordinary user that's just looking for getting your transactions on the blockchain, then go through prof.
And how do you basically merge the blocks? Like, do you use the state merging or?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very simple program that is a fork of the Flashbots builder, which basically just takes a block and then it's a get client. It kind of appends transactions at the end, and produces
Awesome.
produces a new header for the validator. Okay, moving on. Yeah, this is the characteristic that I showed you for latency. This is very unoptimized. Some of you who have more ideas about production level code will see that this is still unoptimized and a lot of kind of improvements in the latency can be easily made. But this is just like, an implement, like it's a prototype for the paper, but still it has pretty good latency in terms of gas used. This is the latency for appending prof transactions. Okay, so going a step further and talking about redistribution to users. So far, we have looked at how you protect users in the sense that the user transaction is not revealed to anybody outside, and they're sequenced in a fair way. So that's a pretty good guarantee. But how do you go even further, which is that any opportunity that's created by users transaction gets redistributed back to them. So for example, if you look at this example, which has two exchanges initially balanced, and Alice buys something on one exchange, the price of that asset will go up on that exchange. An arbitrager can come arbitrage these two exchanges and profit off, in this case, $20. And then it can share some portion of that with Alice. So the arbitrager takes some cut and the rest of it goes to Alice. There are some redistribution mechanisms out there, MEV share, MEV blocker, which do this. And so I'm going to talk about how you can do redistribution even for prof users. Okay, so this is a design that we call prof share, inspired by the name MEV share. This takes prof a step further. So as you can see here, 1, 2, and 3 steps are the same, where you supply the header to the validator and release the prof enrich block once you get the signature. But now something different happens. Once you have got the commitment from your prof enrich for your prof enrich block, you release the entire block for auction, backrunning auction, which is the step 4 here. So you can release the entire block safely for the auction. And now people can submit backrunning bundles and redistribute the MEV back to users from this backrunning. And then once you form the blue block, you append the blue transactions, which are the backrunning transactions, you get a new block. And if that block is better, I mean, it must be better because it has that blue transactions in it, which pay a little bit to the validator. Then you can create a new header for the validator to sign. And then once the validator signs that header, then you can release this block. The idea here, the crucial insight here is that unlike MEV share, which kind of has a trade-off between the privacy for users and the inclusion likelihood. If you go to the MEV share portal, you'll see that if you want to kind of get higher inclusion for your transaction, by that I mean attract more backrunners for your transaction and so on. If you want to get higher inclusion, then or you want to attract backrunners, you have to leak more hints about your transaction. So there's a trade-off there. Here, what we are saying is your transactions are completely private until their inclusion is guaranteed by the validator. And then you can completely release your transactions for backrunning. And you can do that safely because you already have a commitment from the validator. Your transactions are not going to be manipulated. Nothing else will be proposed. Your transactions and their sequence is already finalized, which is blue plus red here. The only thing that can happen now is some backrunning of your transactions. So there are several good properties that you get as a result when you compare it to MEV share and MEV blocker. The idea is, this is just the summary of MEV share, MEV blocker, which also have front-running protection, but they leak hints about the transaction content in order to backrun them. And these are widespread in industry, already quite popular and pivotal for winning auctions. But the kind of benefit that you get in prof share is because you're releasing transactions completely for backrunners. As a result, you can have more efficient backrunning. The backrunners know completely all the information about the transactions. They don't need to guess about it. They don't need to kind of run it in smart contracts. They can do it completely off-chain, also save on gas as well. And another thing that you would notice is that, in some sense, the validator is already committed to your transactions, the prof transactions and the builders block. So now you have to cut in the validator very little, like an epsilon amount for including the backrunning transactions. Versus in MEV share and MEV blocker, you're still competing in the auction. So you still have to cut in the validator. You still have to give you still have to get a significant amount of your reward to the validator. Here you can do it completely for the benefit of the user. Most of the redistribution can go directly to the user from the auction, and the validator needs to be incentivized only epsilon amount to include the backrunning transactions as well. And if you backrun all these prof transactions together, there's also this benefit of organic backrunning. I would suggest MEV share and MEV blocker also do this, which is batch together as many transactions as you can, and then backrun them rather than individually backrunning them, so that users can organically backrun each other. If one user is trading in plus direction and the other user is trading in the opposite direction, then the second user can benefit from the price difference created by the first user. So you can also have organic backrunning when you backrun all of them together. Okay, so I'll show you some economic utility analysis that we did through simulations for different mechanisms, prof share and mev share.
I just have one question before further. Is
Yeah.
there any back running latency penalties, like what penalty that let's say for cost?
Yeah, that's a good question. So prof share definitely has some important caveats. One, you would notice that um, the validator now has to sign two headers, which is not done right now in Mev Boost. These two headers will go to a TE, and the TE or the relay will make sure that both the headers are not released. Only one header is released, so the validator can be assured that it won't be penalized. But nevertheless, you have to make that modification. For prof, you didn't have to make any modification on the validator, but for prof share, you have to sign two headers. The other one is latency. Uh, it's interesting because you are kind of now partitioning the slot in some sense into two. One, the validator commits, and then you're doing the backrunning auction. But notice that the backrunning auction um, need not be just limited to only backrunning transactions. Any new transactions that come in can also be added into that blue part of the block, right? So in some sense, yes, there's some latency, but you can include any other transactions towards the end, so you don't have that latency penalty in practice. Does that make sense? So any new transactions that come in, for example, you can include them in the auction part, the blue part. So in some sense, you have like two auctions going on here: the first PBS auction and the second auction after the prof transactions have been committed to. So the latency here does not reflect in practice because the auction number 4, the blue auction, can happen all the way until the end of the slot.
I think this data is not in the paper, right?
Yes. So we didn't do any empirical analysis of like any data about prof share. I mean, it's quite tricky because it's 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 a little bit of a different design than prof. Prof is much easier to kind of look for the data of the latency penalty from the auctions and so on. For prof share, it's interesting because you are now kind of dividing the block into two auctions. First PBS auction, then a commitment to protected transactions, and then a second auction. So it's a little bit tricky to kind of figure out what kind of how the dynamics of the MEV game will change. But I don't think the latency is a huge concern here because, as I said, the second auction can run until the end of the slot. So you don't have any latency penalty there. Okay. So moving on, this economic utility analysis that we did through simulations between prof share, and mev share. The idea is the model is you have a DEX, a constant product AMM, and an external exchange or external price oracle that in some sense has infinite liquidity, like a centralized exchange. And initially these exchanges are balanced, and then users are trading on the DEX, and arbitragers are arbitraging across the two exchanges. The parameter that we have here is called demand ratio. It's from the finance literature. Demand ratio basically gives you, it's a maximum cap on how much imbalance the trades are. So if you have equal buys and sells, the demand is zero, net demand is zero. But if you have too many buys or too many sells, then the demand is higher. So if we cap the demand ratio, then you will see different characteristics of the utility for users in prof share, and mev share. The idea is as your demand for the users is balanced, it's more positive buys and sells, positive buys and equal amount of negative sells, then there's more opportunity for organic backrunning, and users kind of internalize their price movement more, and so prof and prof share benefit there. So this is the utility analysis. You'll see prof share is better than both the mechanisms because it's protecting the users and it's redistributing the value to them. Prof is better than mev share even without redistribution in some cases where the demand ratio is small. So if you have more chances for organic backrunning, the demand from the users is balanced between buys and sells, then the protection that users get in prof and kind of outweighs any leakage that happens in mev share from arbitragers. But if the demand ratio is quite high, then yes, redistribution definitely gives more value to the users. In most of the blocks, the value is quite, the demand is quite balanced. The demand ratio is small in most of the blocks. The takeaway is prop share is always delivering higher value because of both protection for users, no leakage of value to arbitragers, and also redistribution to the users. And the second takeaway is in low demand ratios, uh, you know, the redistribution is not, prof can do even without redistribution, just from the protection for users. Uh, Now I'll talk about some practical aspects of prof, which is what kind of flexibility do you have in this mechanism? Really, the way I think about prof is it's more of like a broad class of design principle, which is just uh, kind of creating the block as a composition of an auction part at the top and a protected route at the bottom. So that's the broad category or the broad kind of insight in prof. And then you can have various flexibility here. The first one is multiple sequencers. You don't need one prof sequencer. There can be multiple sequencers. Enrichment can happen concurrently, and then you can choose the best enriched block out of all. You can also have sequential enrichment. So prof bundles from multiple sequencers can be appended to each other and have even more enrichment happening. The other flexibility that is very key that one can miss on the outset is that prof sequencer is not a centralized entity. In fact, in all the design that we saw earlier, prof sequencer is a black box entity, right? It can be either a centralized entity, in which case we recommend that it run inside a TEE, but it can very well be a decentralized protocol, a long line of this academic literature, as I mentioned, which talks about decentralized fair sequencing. Those protocols can also serve as prof sequencer. In fact, I think prof can serve as a vehicle or as an opportunity for all the fair sequencing work that has happened in academia to see adoption in practice. The other one is prof supports any ordering policy. I didn't talk about prof supporting only first come, first serve. If you want to have some other customized ordering policy, whatever your notion of fairness is, prof can support that. Finally, I'll talk about one other consideration, which is hybrid deployment. Many relays are optimistic now in the sense that they don't have, they want to save on the latency of simulating the block. And so appending the prof bundle and kind of simulating the final block might not be a kind of possibility in case of optimistic relays, in which case the bundle merging for prof needs to happen at the builders. And so prof bundle merger, instead of running at the relay, runs at the builders, and the relay remains unchanged. So optimistic relays can continue to kind of just get the block from the builder, send it to the validator, but the enrichment is happening at the builders now. And I mean, of course, builders are not trusted entities. In that case, you definitely want the prof bundle merging to happen inside a TE. This kind of mechanism is also useful for enshrined PBS whenever that happens. So you can do the enrichment at the builder, and then the enshrined relay committee, in some sense, in ePBS will work similarly to an optimistic relay. With that, I'd like to conclude and say prof is the simple backward compatible mechanism that's designed to protect users, and it accounts for rational validators. The endgame thesis for prof is that, as we already kind of hinted at earlier, transactions that want top of the priority can go to the PBS route, but they can run the gauntlet of the MEV auction. But transactions that do not want the top of the block priority, all those transactions should go through prof and enjoy higher protection from MEV. The other kind of foreshadowing of some upcoming work is that this kind of mechanism also helps you prevent the externality of latency racing in fair sequencing. So if you were constructing the entire block through, say, a temporal fair ordering, first come, first serve, for example, you have this externality of latency racing. But if you auction off the top of the block, then you don't have that latency racing in prof. With that, if you want to explore more, do look at the website. It has a bunch of interesting FAQs that have come from the community. I've included those on the website. There's also a link to the YouTube demo. And as I mentioned in the starting, Uniswap Foundation is kindly sponsoring $50K for anyone who's willing to help us with productionizing prof. and the paper is just out. It has a lot more details. Because it's designed to be a practical system, we had to consider a lot of details. So you'll see a lot of details, both theoretical and practical, in the paper. With that, I can take more questions, and we can move to the discussion part of the session. I can also show you a live demo, but if there's interest, but the demo is already on the website. We can directly move on to the discussion in that case.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It's super interesting. And I think it's the second time, but I think I've absolutely understood it fully now. But I guess my question is, what do you see as some of the open problems in this space?
Pradyumna, I didn't catch the last part of the sentence. Don't you see what?
What do you see as the open problems in this space after prof?
If somebody else caught that, can you please repeat that for me?
No, I think predominantly you have to type, because I think it's the,
Yeah, if you
the
can
noisy
type.
background. Yeah, you can type, I think, yeah. But other in a like a quieter environment, you can just use a mic and to ask the question. Yeah. Oh, so predominantly my question is like, what do you see as the open problems in the space? Yeah.
That's such a great question. Let's see. I do think that's a great question, but let me kind of like take a step back and talk about the meta here. I do think that there are many open problems, but because of the way the industry has progressed, we are kind of in this, we have put on these blinkers and we are thinking about open problems only from one context. Say open problems in terms of PBS, open problems in terms of order flow auctions, open problems of how do we redistribute the value as much as to users, how do we not have these kind of backroom deals happening between builders and order flow providers, all of that, right? But so little has the community explored or the industry explored in terms of fair sequencing. I mean, Arbitrum is doing a very good job of it, but so little has the community explored that I would like to focus more on the open problems that arise once you deploy some of these fair ordering and protected solutions. So I'd be actually much more interested in what kind of problems we see when we kind of have more principled and protected routes for users. With that being said, I think there are kind of like a few kind of legitimate concerns about how do we kind of distinguish between good MEV and bad MEV. I think that question remains open. That's probably one of the bigger questions. Once we have a handle on that, I think we can design our mechanisms to target the elimination of bad MEV.
Oh, I just have a quick add up. So since you mentioned like the good MEV and the bad MEV, so some researchers in the field that I have mentioned, some MEV like the arbitrage stuff can actually help the for example some tokens price to reach as it should be, because like kind of to stabilize the demand and supply stuff. So he thinks like those kind of MEV or the arbitrage action actually bring more value to the table instead of just extract value from the users. Yeah, and I think there will be some. We will host some like discussion around that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question, and that question still is, I think, in some sense, even open in TradFi, because TradFi has lots of HFT behavior going on, and a lot of people do kind of, don't think that the HFT behavior is good for the markets or good for users. Like they're not providing any value to the society. That's the argument for I'm speaking for some people in the TradFi community. So it's very interesting question, and you definitely need some arbitrage for the functioning of the markets. But at what frequency should it be there, and how much resources should go into them? Should all the best PhDs coming from the best colleges be working on quant trading for the society? Maybe no. So this question is still open, I think, even in TradFi.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Hi.
I
Oh,
would
sorry.
add, like, is there someone else who wants to
Go
go
ahead.
first?
Go ahead.
I think I have used two of my questions already, so I think you should go first. I'll go after you if you have more time.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, like, do you see like a chicken and egg problem, like having very little transactions at the beginning and not getting included, or?
So I guess two things. One, um, it's only a block by block basis. So in whatever blocks you get transactions, you can get included. In some blocks that you don't get any transaction flow through prof, it's not a problem. You do the regular relay and the regular auction, and you produce the block that way. So only in the blocks that you get order flow, you kind of assemble the block. And if you saw the graph, it doesn't take too many transactions. Yes, there's it gets better as you have more and more transactions, but even with a couple of transactions, you can get pretty good high inclusion rates, because only in some slots do you have high latency penalty. In majority of the slots, uh, you can compensate for that small latency of about tens of milliseconds by just paying a little bit. So, and the other thing is, you know, the slow start problem is only there if you want to keep the overheads like very minimal, like 1 GUI, 2 GUI, 3 GUI. If the prof transactions are willing to pay say 10 GUI of in tips, even one transaction can compensate for the latency penalty, right? So there's this three-dimensional relationship, and the more you're willing to pay, even with small number of transactions, you can get included.
Yeah, I want to ask something. For example, imagine if more number of transactions inside a block are actually coming from prof. So in a way, don't you think like because in prof there is no sophisticated solving going on, so maybe there's a time which is being let's say saved in solving those profitable block in that way. And also, if you don't have that very competitive MEV happening, meaning you're not stuffing your block with like sandwiching or front running transaction. So at the end of it, do you think you will end up saving not only the time for solving, but also the space which could have been consumed by MEV related transactions like sandwiching, front running, back running, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, and it's a good point for discussion. There's no question for me there. Um, I'd like to discuss it with you all, and I do agree with the sentiment in that comment that a lot of kind of block space is being wasted, a lot of energy of the researchers is being wasted in here, and this is not the ideal market structure for sure, and regulators do know it. And we think that this is complicated behavior and so much complications are happening and regulators are not aware of it. But believe me, regulators are on top of this, and a lot of this does fall into categories that are very well studied by them, namely insider information and insider trading. So it's definitely not ideal, and I do think once more transactions enjoy protection, um, it'll just be better for the ecosystem. You'll waste less time, less resources in terms of block space. And we are not going completely to a world where there's no solving, there's no information. As I said, this is a very sweet spot, in my opinion, between the two approaches, where you auction off some part of the top of the block to prioritize people who want that sex tax arbitrage and who will otherwise build out that HFT infrastructure. You know, uh, and then you have the part where users are protected. In prof share, you have a third part, which is again an auction. So I think it's a very sweet spot between the designs. I'm of course
Okay,
biased.
yes, sir. Yeah. So just one last question. Like, why did you choose just PEE not FHE or MPC in that case? I know some people at IC3 are very like in America is like all over with this FHE and MPC. Yes, so just wondering.
It's just that we want to be kind of appending these transactions as fast as possible to kind of minimize that latency penalty. And if you have a faster way of doing it through MPC and FHE, then definitely that would be a better solution. But currently, TEs are by far the fastest way to append these transactions in a way that you can protect against honest but curious or passive adversaries. So I do think if the technology improves to a point where it's competitive with TEs, then definitely MPC and FHE are on the table.
All right, thanks, Kushal.
Yeah, thank you for asking great questions.
Are there any other questions? Okay. So if you still have, please feel free to reach out to Kushal, and would love to give another round of applause, but I can only do this like in a virtual way. And yeah, so thanks to Kushal again from Monad Labs, and thanks Bria from IC3 for supporting this whole event. And this is Aiden. I'm hosting this Intersubjective Rhizome, which is a co-research blockchain community. And if you want to have the same discussion or like a research outcome to share, please feel reach out to me on Telegram. I'll share my handle in the chat box, and I'll looking forward to see you in next research-centric discussion. And I'll share all the slides and the recordings later once they are ready. Thank you guys for coming, and please do have a good weekend. Thank you again, Kushal, and thanks everyone.
Thank you for having me. Have a good weekend.
Of course. Yeah. Okay. Bye, guys. Ciao.
Yeah.
Bye, guys. Ciao.